progress.
Help me through. Oh. My iPad.
Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I apologize for my tardiness. I almost spoiled my perfect attendance record.
I know. I was going to have to open. I mean, it's just I didn't have the agenda open. So,
Okay. The scare averted. So let us call the Federated City Employees Retirement System and Federated City Employees Healthcare Trust meeting of April 2022 to order. And we will have a roll call vote. Trustee Chandra. I'm sorry, not a roll call vote, but a roll call. Trustee Chandra, are you present?
No, he's not present, Spencer. He's feeling under the weather, so he probably won't be in today.
Very good, understood. Trustee Orr.
Present.
Vice Chair Jennings.
Present.
Trustee Kelleher.
Present.
Trustee Linder.
Present.
And Trustee Avasti.
Present.
Very good. I believe we will immediately go into closed session and return to open session after we hear the closed session item. So please stand by as we move into a closed session meeting room. A couple of ground rules. We are continuing to meet virtually at this meeting and are doing so pursuant to AB 361. As such, all votes will be roll call votes. If you are not speaking, please be on mute to cut background noise. For discussion items, each trustee will have a turn to speak in roll call order, more than once if desired. The public will also have an opportunity to speak on each item after trustees. The public will also have an opportunity to speak actually at the beginning of the meeting on any item not on the public agenda. So at this time, as a result of public input, we are taking public comment at the beginning of the session on any item that is not on the agenda, but that is under the subject matter of this board. Members of the public wish to provide comment at this time may do so by, quote, raising your hand, unquote, in the Zoom app, or joining by telephone, by pressing *9 on your telephone keyboard. When addressing the board, press *6 to unmute or mute. Please state your name for the record prior to providing your comments. While City Council normally restricts public comment to 2 minutes per speaker, I am using the chair's discretion to allow up to 3 minutes per speaker. And I will remind trustees, staff, and the public that while we are hearing public comment, we cannot discuss any item that is not on the agenda further. So are there any members of the public who wish to address this board at this time? And Linda, if you can help me spot any hands raised, I would appreciate that.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yes, I see Brad.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm unable to raise my hand for some reason on my system.
Okay.
So I apologize for that, but I'll defer if anybody else has their hand raised.
Well, let's, the chair recognizes Brad. If you could state your full name for the record, and you have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Brad Imamura. I'm a taxpayer and also happen to be a beneficiary of the Federated retirements system, and appreciate this opportunity to speak, and also appreciate, Mr. Chair, that you have placed this item at the beginning of the agenda. I think it would certainly help people who want to participate not having to wait for the whole meeting and agenda in order to speak. However, there is an item that is not on the agenda. I did bring it up the last meeting. This is in regards to the current retiree representative on the Federated Retirement Board. I believe that there should be and request that an item be agendized to further investigate how this person was appointed to the board. I was a candidate that expressed interest in being on the board, having been an active retiree, an active representative when I was employed with the city of San Jose for 12 years on the board. I was also chair of the board for a number of years. And so I felt that I had a lot of experience, and seeing as how there was a lot of turnover in board members, that it was important to have some stability. I was not given the opportunity to interview before the Retiree Association. As you know, the Retiree Association does not represent the majority of the retirees from the Federated system. They are a private group, in order to be a member of that group, you have to pay fees every month. They charge each member a monthly fee in order to be a member. I don't know what their purpose is. I view them as a lobbying group. As you are aware, and I'm not privy to it, you certainly have more information than I do, that there was a lawsuit initiated by the Retiree Association against the Federated Retirement Board, and ultimately the citizens and the taxpayers of the city of San Jose who fund the Federated Retirement System. I think this is an embarrassment, and it's as me speaking as a taxpayer, I am extremely disturbed by this action by a few members of, well, maybe it's not a few. I've understand it's over 20 members of the Retiree Association that seek to benefit from this lawsuit, and they've used the fees that they charge to the retirees who opt to be members of this association to fund the legal counsel that they're using to sue the retirement boards. So my question is, and I am asking your board counsel to look into this, as to why this association is being allowed by the city council and to force the retirement board to accept this individual that was appointed by this association that doesn't represent the majority of the retirees. You may be aware, maybe not, there are some new board members who aren't aware that the city council stripped the voting rights of the retirees by not having elections to appoint their retiree representative. I think that should be looked into. You as a board do not have to accept what the council forces you to accept, a retiree representative who is a party to this lawsuit. I gave the example of a private board. Why would a private board, say you're on the Apple board, why would you accept a board member that's in the process of suing the Apple Corporation? I mean, this would be totally ridiculous. So it's
Mr.
analogous
Moore?
to that. And thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you. I believe our 3-minute limit has been achieved. Counsel Liederman, you have your hand raised?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Without commenting on the matter and public comment that the gentleman raises, for the benefit of the board, I should advise you that this is outside the jurisdiction of this board. The selection of the retiree representative or retiree member to our board is entirely within the purview and jurisdiction of the city council. And this board has no ability to accept, reject, or otherwise influence that selection process. So I appreciate the gentleman's comments, but for the board, I must say that this is a matter that is not within the subject matter jurisdiction of this board, and therefore it's not something that we can appropriately put on a future agenda. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Counsel Liederman, for that clarification. I believe that does answer many questions that trustees may have. Are there any other members of the public who wish to speak at this time? I see a hand from Jill Borders. The chair recognizes you. Please unmute and proceed.
Thank you. I'm so glad that the gentleman just chimed in on the answer or feedback about that information, because that's so clarifying in the moment. So I know you're not supposed to respond, but oftentimes when you guys are able to, it's so helpful. The next thing I wanted to say is that's one of the reasons that I'm attending these meetings and that I don't completely understand what's going on, is I do get these nuggets of information and pieces and bits from public comment and from other people's comments and discussion. So first, I'd like to thank the chair for offering the 3-minute time for that gentleman to speak. And at the beginning, that is so kind and helpful to us in the public. And then secondly, I want to comment to the other gentleman. I know I don't think I can. So I'll just say that I appreciate the comment, and I will look forward to doing a little bit more research into that myself. If that is something that, as a public member, that I can comment on at open forum and at the city council and do a little research myself to bring some fairness and just sort of an inquisitive mind wanting to understand why that would be not an agenda item that could be here. Those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to do to push forward some transparency and know what's going on. So I appreciate this opportunity very much. I do think it is helpful, just to start to become more aware of what we need to know. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other members of the public who wish to speak at this time? Staff, are we seeing any other hands? I can't always see all the hands. I don't know why Zoom works this way, but it does.
Mr. Chair, I do not see any hands.
Thank you. Okay, then we will proceed with the orders of the day. I intend to take a break at around the 10 o'clock hour. And of course, there will be a recess from 1 to 1:05 to accommodate the Civic Center TV broadcasting system. I'm asking board members to stay on the Zoom call after the regular meeting ends to conduct the special AB 361 meetings for the various committees. Understand we do not need to waive sunshine. So may I have an order to accept the orders of the day? May I have a motion rather to accept the orders of the day?
So motion by Trustee Kelleher.
So moved by Trustee Kelleher. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Trustee Linder. Is there any comment from trustees or the public? Hearing none, we will have a roll call vote. Trustee Chandra is absent, so Trustee Orr.
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings.
Aye.
Trustee Kelleher.
Aye.
Trustee Linder.
Aye.
Trustee Avasti.
Aye.
And I vote aye, passes unanimously. And we will proceed with the agenda. And what is the next agenda item?
Would be the consent calendar.
I'm sorry?
It would be the consent calendar.
Oh, I'm sorry, consent calendar. Do we have a motion to adopt the consent calendar as presented in the agenda? Do I hear such a motion?
So motion by Trustee Kelleher.
We have a motion from Trustee Keller. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second from Trustee Linder. Any discussion by trustees or by the public? Hearing none. Trustee Orr, how do you vote?
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings?
Aye.
Trustee Keller?
Aye.
Trustee Linder?
Aye.
Trustee Avasti?
Aye.
And I vote aye. It passes unanimously. Now we will proceed with the next agenda item. And I believe that's agenda item number 2, death and survivorship notification. We will have a moment of silence for those who have served the city and who have passed. Thank you. On to item number 3, investments. We have an oral update by the CIO. Mr. Palani, please give us the good news.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The good news is we are up 2 basis points fiscal year to date. We are not down. So that's well, we were up 30% last year. We are not down 30% this year, and that's the nature of it. And even though we've had, I think the chair wants to say something.
No, I'm just, I guess 2 basis points are better than none. So
that is correct. So no, I think the point I was trying to make is I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to share the good news, but there are S&P is down 7% year to date, or roughly thereabouts. The Nasdaq is down even more, and there's certainly a bear market in certain sectors, as you know. And I get this question from the City Council often. Why are you not simply invested in the S&P 500? And this is why. And so while in general, the S&P over long periods of time tends to trade up, there are periods in history when the market is down as a whole, and which is why we run a well-diversified portfolio. We invest in real estate, real assets, commodities, fixed income, and so on. and that really cushions the blow on the downside. So we have just one agenda item, that's the SAA, Strategic Asset Allocation for Healthcare Trust. And before I turn this over to Laura, I did want to share with the board that I just came back from a 2-day conference in San Francisco, which is the Pension Bridge Annual Conference. It's a pretty large conference attended by plan sponsors such as ourselves, other asset allocators, endowments and foundations and so on, and some money managers as well. It was very nice to see people in person. There was a lot of energy. Of course, one is always scared when you attend these events. You hope that they're not super spreader events. Credit to Trustee Orr. I think she was the only participant in a crowd of 300 who was wearing a mask. And so some of our trustees were there. Trustee Chandra was there. Several trustees from the Police and Fire Board were also there. And they stuck my panel at the very end of the conference, which is very clever. So they forced me to stay for 2 days. But again, these are good conferences to exchange notes with our peers, to find out what else is happening out there. And you usually learn 1 or 2 things from these conferences. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take questions. So the 2 basis points that I gave you was as of 2 days ago. So again, these are unofficial, unaudited numbers. These are estimates from Makita. And we have a few more weeks left in the fiscal year. Again, the 2 basis points is positive, but as you all know, that's almost 6.5% below our discount rate. So to that extent, we will have UAL from this year. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from trustees?
I don't have any questions, but I would like to congratulate our CIO for a very good performance on a adjusted basis, given the market performance. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Trustee Kelleher.
Any other comments from trustees? Any comment on this agenda item from the public? So hearing none, we'll move forward to item 3B, which
Jill
is...
Borders.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did miss the hand there. Ms. Borders, please proceed on this, a comment on this agenda item.
Hi, thank you. I just want to say, I'm learning, as I learn more about what all of these groups are and what they're all about, when we say that things are up and things are good, I am concerned that, and you have to do your, I guess my understanding is your fiduciary responsibility, which is first and foremost to protect the investments, and that is your role, which is so important, and I respect that. But I just want to sort of be the echo, I guess, in the background of saying that when we do have real estate investments, we have to understand that embedded within this portfolio are many, many people that have become victims to really a housing market that is crushing, quite frankly, crushing us. And meaning that the renter, the person who's renting and renting that keeps going up and up and up, those who are, in the business of having owned assets, this includes pensions, this includes retirement boards and things of this nature. When you go up, it is most likely oftentimes because rents are going up. Well, that's good for a lot of people, but not good for a lot of people. And so I do see this as sort of one of those double-edged swords where if we start to do what we have to do, which is build supply, a lot of it, how would that impact these funds? And so for people that don't have or don't own, we often kind of see this as, well, this is interesting because if we build a lot and there's a lot of supply and prices go down, what does that do to all of these pensions, right? So it's an interesting situation to be on the outside looking into all of these people with REITs and real estate investments that are doing well, knowing that your rent's going up and you're not doing well. So just the flip side of the coin, just wanted to say that for the record today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Borders. Any other comment on this agenda item? So hearing none, we will turn to item 3B, which is discussion and action on the strategic asset allocation for the healthcare trust. And I believe we have a presentation from Makita.
That's right, Mr. Chairman. So before I hand this over to Laura, just a reminder to the board, we usually follow the SAA on healthcare trust once we pass the pension. And we did pass the pension SAA through this board last month. And now we're following up with the SAA on healthcare trust. We did have a conversation with the IC chair, who was unfortunately not present today. But Laura will present this and we will take feedback.
Great. Laura, please proceed.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I also was fortunate enough to attend the Pension Bridge Conference, and it was really nice to see Trustee Orr and Mr. Polani in person and get to catch up a bit. And I agree, it's a good conference if you all are able to attend in the future. And with my whole family having had COVID about a month ago, I felt especially comfortable traveling and being around a lot of people. So in terms of today's presentation, we typically try to bring the healthcare trust asset allocation discussion pretty soon after you all make decisions on the pension asset allocation, mainly because even though these are two very different plans and have different characteristics, we want to make sure that the investment strategy is generally aligned strategically. So if we take a look at the introduction on page 2, the actuarial assumed rate of return for this plan is 6%, so lower than the pension trust. We still predict that and foresee that this asset allocation that you have in place currently should achieve over a 6% return over the long term. We have taken a look based on input from your internal investment team and investment committee, another asset allocation option, which would reduce emerging markets a bit. We also typically compare to a 60-40 global equity bond allocation, just for your information on what that looks like. So, you know, similar to the pension trust, in this document, we put together a variety of analysis to help you either affirm your current asset allocation or consider the other option that we've shown or others. On page 3, you've seen this chart many times, but as you know, it's a lot harder to achieve a rate of return that should pay benefits in the future than it used to be. And then I think I can skip ahead to page 6, where we look at the current healthcare trust asset allocation on the left, with 30% US equity, 14 in non-US developed markets equity, 15 in emerging markets equity, and then 5% in short-term bonds and 36% in other assets, which includes investment-grade bonds at 14%, core real estate at 12%, commodities at 5%, and long-term government bonds at 5%. So, you know, as you know, this is a plan that needs to stay liquid. So we don't have private equity and other private assets in this plan. The closest that you have to that is core real estate, which is quarterly liquid. It can sometimes have a queue to get out, so it can be a bit longer than quarterly, but it's still much more liquid than, say, an 8 to 10 year lockup private equity type investment. Also, because you don't have private markets assets, you know, we've used things like commodities and long-term government bonds as sort of the only available sources of diversification. You can see that it has a long-term expected rate of return over the next 20 years of approximately 6.4% on average per year. We know that that won't be totally accurate in short term or any given year, but we do expect that that would be the long-term average over that time horizon, or somewhere close to that. And then the Makita standard deviation here is 12.2. We don't, in your investment policy for the healthcare trust, have language around needing to stay under 12%. But I can say confidently that if Veris were to run the standard deviations, that these would all be below 12%, since their numbers always tend to come in lower than ours. If we take a look at mixed A, you can see the difference here is that emerging markets equity would be 12% instead of 15%. And so that 3% that we'd take from emerging markets equity would go 2% to developed markets equity and 1% to short-term investment grade bonds. That would lead to the same expected return over the 20-year time period, slightly lower return on the 10 years, so very slightly lower return overall, but rounds to the same. And that also would have a lower standard deviation in our estimation. So about the same return with less volatility. And then we look here at the 60-40, which would not be expected to obtain your assumed target rate of return over the long term, but we wanted you to see it for purposes of comparison. We can take a look at the peer group on page 8. So, as we've discussed in the past, and it's turned out to be a good thing in this, equity bull market that we've had for the past 12 or so years, but your plan, your healthcare trust is a bit more aggressive or equity heavy than a lot of peers. You can see the median peer allocation to equity is 27%, or about half of what is in this plan. There has been progress on the assumed rate of return. It used to be the same as the pension several years ago. Now you all have voted to move down the expected rate of return for healthcare. And so it's been had an ability to get a little bit more conservative over time. When we look at peer relative ranks, it's been very good for this trust that it has been equity heavy given recent market environments and outperformance relative to peers. On page 9, I'll just quickly mention before turning it over to my colleague Jared, the mean variance optimization based risk analysis. You can see that there's not a huge difference in our expectations for the current allocation and mix A. Mix A with a lower volatility would be expected to have slightly less catastrophic worst case scenario returns, slightly lower probability of experiencing negative returns, but also a slightly lower probability of achieving that 6% return. Most of our clients like to adopt an asset allocation that has at least a 50% probability of achieving the assumed rate of return, and both the current allocation and Mix A have that. I'll turn it over to Jared Pratt to talk a little bit about the next few slides and some other types of analysis that we've done.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, everybody. So as you know, we like to look at risk in a few different ways, and some of these slides maybe put it in a little bit more of a tangible sense. So here we're looking at historical negative scenarios. We're basically looking at the exposures each plan has. How did those underlying, broad markets do in actual historical events? And then we roll it all up to the portfolio level. So this isn't actually how Fed did, for example, in COVID or 2008. It's just how the underlying exposures did. So if these events were to repeat tomorrow, this is what we would expect to happen. And as you can see, there's not a huge difference between the two mixes. As we just talked about, they're both equity heavy. And so we would expect a little bit larger magnitude losses in these scenarios compared to peers. And when we look at the positive side, obviously that goes both ways.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
I was reading through this before. I didn't bother to Google it, but what's the taper tantrum? I don't know that.
So that is when the Fed raised, I guess, kind of it surprised the market with not purchasing assets to the extent everybody was expecting. So they were starting to taper their market support and kind of surprised the market and caught everybody off guard a little bit, and markets didn't respond well. I don't know, Laura, if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect description. I'm not exactly sure who came up with the term taper tantrum. Having small children tantrum is a word we use frequently, but yeah, it was just, we think it's a good historical scenario to look at because we are in another market environment where, the Fed is sort of withdrawing some of the support in different ways that it's provided the market recently. So it's just one of those historical scenarios that we want to take a look at.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to follow Trustee Jennings and just say the popping of the TMT bubble. I'm assuming that's the sort of the internet.
Yes. Yep.
And what does TMT stand for?
It's technology, media, telecom, I believe. So it's the .com bubble essentially.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah, it's
I'm not sure if it was a good question, but.
Yeah, no, it's actually nice. A lot of people just look at this slide and like, okay, a lot of bad stuff when, how would we have done? So it's nice to actually get some questions about what these are.
LTCM.
Long-term capital management.
Yeah.
I almost feel like we need a decoder ring for all these.
Yeah.
Mark,
yeah, we should put a glossary in here, but it's also fun to get to talk about what they were.
Yeah. Can we just flip? And we do have dates associated with that, so you can see, when these events happened, and maybe not how they were named, but what they correspond with. And so on.
Yeah, and we're constantly adding new ones. You know, we haven't had a ton of market shocks in the last, 12 years, but the COVID-19 market shock, the first one there is a new addition. Just,
Yeah,
and,
that
you know,
was a big
and these are all based on indexed returns, because we don't necessarily, all of the strategies in your portfolio haven't been around, in all these historical market environments. So we would hope that you all have, you have some active management in the portfolio and that those managers can protect on the downside. So this is sort of beta returns for the asset allocation, the asset classes that are in it for these different historical scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the questions, everybody. So as you can see, with the slightly lower volatility expected from Mix A taps the brakes a little bit more on the down markets, but just slightly. Here we can look at, on the next page, going the other way. So very strong positive returns when equity markets rally. Again, Mix A doesn't quite keep up as much as the current plan, but again, the difference is very small. Another thing we can look at is current valuations, interest rates, and do more of a shock analysis on what do we think would happen if rates, in this case, rose quite a bit, or credit spreads blew out, or equities declined. And so again, the equity sensitivity in both mixes, we would expect the results you see here, where credit spreads and equities falling would have a large impact. And then on the next slide, that kind of goes the other way as well. Then at the bottom, equities going up 30% would bring the portfolio along quite a bit, considering the heavy equity mix inside. And then finally, another way we can look at it is more broad level. As we know, the market's always pricing in expectations, and so the market is responding positively or negatively to surprises. And so here we look at 4 surprise factors. What happens when the market is surprised by interest rates, or by inflation, by growth estimates, or by systemic events like 2008. And here on the page 15, we can see the response to that. So probably not surprisingly, the portfolio, when this was the same case for the pension plan, the biggest response is to growth surprises or systemic risk. And the reason we take those risks is highlighted in this bottom bullet point, which is that those are the highest compensated risks as well. So that's why the portfolio is positioned how it is and how we try to achieve that 6% hurdle rate. So with that, I'll pass it back to Laura.
Thank you, Jared. Just to summarize, we think that the current asset allocation is quite reasonable, but we did provide another for your information and consideration, and we look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments from trustees and/or Mr. Polani, if you would like to comment?
Yeah, if there are no comments from trustees, Mr. Chairman, we did discuss this with the IC chair, and both, Makita staff and the IC chair all felt comfortable with Mix A. But as Laura said, the current mix is reasonable as well. But we're looking for feedback. You can certainly make a recommendation to either stay current or adopt Mix A, or if you have any feedback and want us to run additional scenarios, we're happy to do that as well.
Great. Were there any questions or comments or
Yeah, I have one.
statements from trustees? Vice Chair Jennings, please.
So the IC committee is suggesting to go to Mix A. Is that what I heard?
Actually, Trustee Jennings, the investment committee actually did not get a chance to review this because the last investment committee meeting was a couple of months ago. Did discuss this just with the IC chair. Having said that,
the IC chair.
Yeah, we do have luckily an investment committee meeting coming up next week.
Okay, and let me ask you another question. I didn't see that much of a difference between the two. So if we were to go to Mix A, what is the, what does that do to your staff and all the other people? I mean, so I don't see a major, one way or another to make that move. And if that puts a lot more extra, administrative work and, for little gain, I don't know if the cost benefit is there. So what is the cost for your staff and.
That's a great question. These are all very public and liquid assets. As Laura mentioned, we have no private assets in this portfolio. So the transition is pretty simple. But you asked about costs, and there are transactions costs every time we make, and they might be trivial, but in the long run they do add up. So there will be some transactions costs. They may not be huge transactions costs, but when you buy and sell securities, you do pay commissions on those the trades, right? So, but in terms of staff time, again, there is a cost. I won't say it's zero, but these are fairly easy moves.
Okay. I'm just curious, Trustee Orr, since you're on the investment committee, do you have any input on that?
I don't have further input, but I have reactions, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I guess that, yeah.
It's similar to, the work that's there that they've put in, similar to the strategic asset allocation work they do for the Federated side. You're sort of seeing things that are, not dramatically different, which makes obviously the decision feel somewhat harder. I think the focus is around this reduction in emerging markets equity. And I'm actively and intentionally trying not to bring any of my own personal biases and emotions, right, to the conversation. But what I'm seeing is, a reasonable reallocation. And from an expected return perspective, I'd be really quite comfortable as well with Mix A. But I'm agnostic in that if we were to hold current, that's just fine as well. That's my own personal opinion.
Trustee Kelleher, how about you?
Sort of my reaction, just in terms of emerging markets and transaction costs. Having run a transition management business for 15 years or something, I cringe at our CIO saying that they're trivial costs just because that was my life. But I do think that transaction costs in emerging markets are significant. I think it's probably fine. I wouldn't be terribly opposed to moving to Mix A, but I do think we want to model the transaction costs to make sure we understand what they actually are, because they can be as much as 1 or 2% for emerging markets.
Retirement board people are so full of crap.
Okay.
I would just mention, the way that you invest in emerging markets matters, and you all invest through a fund. So the nice thing about a fund is that transaction costs are shared across everyone in the fund. And if you have a lot of investors, it ends up being trivial, and you all end up, negatively benefiting from that, or negatively being affected by that when somebody else sells out. But making that relatively small move from 15 to 12, I think we should think more about potential investment implications. The emerging markets are a volatile asset class. So I think, market moves are probably more significant in that asset class than transaction costs that you might pay. As I mentioned, you do have the 6% expected rate of return. It can be hard to get there without a significant emerging markets allocation, since that's one of the highest returning asset classes. But you could still get there at the 12%, be a bit more in line with peers, and have less volatility. So we think it's worth considering.
That's very helpful, Laura. Thank you.
And Trustee Kelleher is absolutely right. I mean, I didn't mean to trivialize the costs, obviously, but if you're buying and selling EM stocks directly, the bid-ask spread can be pretty wide, right, compared to US stocks, and you can run up a lot of transactions costs. But a lot of these are invested passively and through funds. So what's passed on is, and that's what I meant by trivial.
Thank you.
But if I could add one comment, please. I don't have the information right in front of me, but I would imagine that Mix A probably has a lower expense ratio, just moving from an emerging market fund somewhat to probably lower expense ratio products. So
that's a good.
If CIO Polani would agree, I don't have the expense ratios in front of me.
That's a very good point, because even EM equity, even when you invest passively, we do pay higher fees. Then in this case, it's going to like short-term bonds, and which is literally very, very low cost and passive, and even developed markets are cheaper to invest in than emerging markets.
So is it safe to say that the actual cost of maintaining Mix A net of whatever transaction costs made, one-time transaction costs, the cost of maintaining Mix A is actually lower than the cost of maintaining our current allocation.
It's fair to say that, though I would have to also point out that these expected returns are net of fees. Correct me if I'm wrong, Laura.
I would add too,
that's correct.
sorry, Laura, yeah. I mean, I think it really depends on the time period, Trustee Horowitz, as well. So I think it's directionally correct, or with a relative confidence that your statement is valid. And I also would probably add, I feel pretty comfortable with respect to the pathway of getting from point HCT current to Mix A, given the team's experience with just running reallocations. It's sort of, it's not something new and different and terribly hard for them. So I'm comfortable with that. They have full discretion and the expertise to make it happen.
Yeah, my own view is that we shouldn't let the transaction cost tail wag the asset allocation dog. They are relatively low compared to the value of assets, especially since they are passively held in wider funds. The difference between the two, in my view, is relatively small. However, I am encouraged to see a lower allocation to emerging markets. Last month, when we reviewed the main plan, we discovered that our allocation to emerging markets was almost the highest of all of our peer groups. So we are kind of overcommitted currently to emerging markets. And while they do have constantly had a higher expected return, over the last 10 years, I think they've rather disappointed, and they haven't delivered the higher expectations that that many had for them. So I'm quite comfortable moving to Mix A, especially in sight of the fact that it is a relatively small change for the portfolio overall.
Okay, so are we ready?
Well, we need a motion. Is there a motion either to maintain the current plan or to move to Mix A?
I'll put forward a motion to move to Mix A.
So we have a motion from Vice Chair Jennings. Do we have a second for that motion?
Second.
So we have a second from Trustee Orr. Is there further discussion by trustees? Is there any public comment? Hearing none, we will vote. In roll call order, Trustee Orr.
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings.
Aye.
Trustee Keller.
Aye.
Was that an aye?
That was an aye.
Very good. Trustee Linder.
Aye.
And Trustee Avasti.
Aye.
And I vote aye as well, so it passes unanimously to move to Mix A. Thank you, Makita, and thank you, staff.
Thank you.
And if we can see the next agenda item. Apparently, there's no old business, so we have new business, and it's an oral update from the CEO. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if you bear with me, just a couple of minutes. First and foremost, I wanted to remind the board that staff has been in a hybrid approach the last month. We started in mid-March. And so everyone is coming to the office pretty much 2 days a week at the office, and the rest working remotely. I also wanted to share with you that we had a soft opening of the office late last week. So our doors are open from 9 to 4. We haven't really advertised it, but they're open, although we continue recommending to members that would like to come by the office to the extent possible to make sure that they reach out so they can make appointments for the particular discussion and a time so that we can spread the members coming over for meetings. So just wanted to share that with you. I also wanted to, I don't know if you had a chance to go over the quarterly newsletter that we included on the communications. I wanted to take this opportunity to do a couple of things. First, to thank the staff that leads that work with our communication consultant, which is Barbara Heyman and Linda Alexander, with the quality of the newsletter, very good information. And I also wanted to give kudos to our Chief Investment Officer. I don't know if you guys had a chance to see the newsletter, but he was recently named one of Trustee Insight top transformational leaders over the last 5 years. And Trustee Insight is the world's largest limited partner network, bringing global investment and market information, professional connections, and news to institutional investors. So again, we just wanted to publicly congratulate our CIO for that recognition. He does a lot of work, and I know he a lot of these accomplishments he also shared with the great job and support of the investment staff. So Prabhu, congratulations. I also wanted to let you know that the cost of living for Federated retirees will be included in this April benefits payment. So everyone should be happy. As you know, Tier 3 has a 3% fixed cost of living. I also wanted to share with you that our new network technician started last month. So it's been almost a full month that has been working at the office. I get to see him whenever I come to the office because for some reason, when I warm up my lunch, I do it about 30 seconds before he gets there. So he always have to wait for me. I also wanted to share with you that our process for the selection and recruitment of the IT manager is in the last stages. I think that we have made an offer, and I understand, Barbara, if I'm mistaken, you can correct me. I believe it has been accepted. So hopefully by the next meeting, we'll have a name to go and an introduction to go with the IT manager position. I also wanted to share with you the city just recently revised its masking policy. So it has lifted the mandate to wear a mask. Of course, employees can wear a mask if they so choose, and also anyone that visit city facilities, but it's not mandated anymore. The city also has launched a mandatory 2-part foundational racial equity training for all the employees, and the 2 trainings are taking place actually this month. Lastly, I wanted to share with you that I'm assuming by now you have done so, but the conflict of interest filing with the city clerk at the city of San Jose was due April 1st. I hope you all had a chance to work through it and file it. If you haven't, please reach out and let us know so we can help you finalize it and file it as soon as possible, because again, it was due on April 1st. The staff also asked me to share with you the reminder about the waiver of recourse fees to be paid for the fiduciary insurance. But I'm going to leave that discussion to further down on 5E. There's an item on fiduciary insurance and waiver of recourse fees, which will address that there. And further down, there's also a 5G fiduciary education to be presented by General Counsel, where he will speak probably on those issues as well. So with that, that concludes my comments, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pena. Are there any questions from trustees? Any questions from the members of the public? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Pena. We will move forward to item 5B, an oral update from the City Council Liaison.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to give a little update on the budget. We do have good news for once, and it's fairly good news. We have a projected ongoing surplus every year for each of the next 5 years, and they're each around give or take about $25 million, so give or take a couple million each way. And so that I had a meeting with the budget director and the city manager in the last week, and the idea, of course, is to ensure that we have enough in our reserves so that we know it's a when, not an if. There is a downturn, we have enough to smooth that out. And I also asked about, is there any possibility for using some of that money to pay down our unfunded liability on the pension? And they are working on a policy proposal that they're going to be coming to us in the fall with. And they're also prioritizing moving the services that have been covered for many years with one-time funds, moving those into the ongoing fund bucket, as well as, of course, restoring services. And I think many of you know our public safety police department in particular has been as we say, the most thinly staffed police department of any big city. We need to add to it. It always was, and even by adding 250 additional officers, it still will be, but it would give us a lot more resources to help with many of the issues that have been cropping up since the pandemic. And finally, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the budget, the study sessions will start on May 11th, and we will be talking about them. There's a whole schedule of that, and I'm sure that Roberto makes that available to you all. But the overview of the city budget will be on Wednesday morning, May 11th, if you want to get the overview and then delve into the draft documents from there. And that's it for my report.
Thank you. Are there any questions from trustees?
No, Mr. Chair, I do want to thank Councilmember Davis for the update, especially regarding the budget. Much appreciated. And I also wanted to let her know on your board that I will be at the City Council meeting next week presenting a short presentation for the actuarial valuation results and the actuarial audit. So I will be there next week, Councilmember Davis. It should be a short presentation.
Yes, looking forward to that. I saw that was on the agenda when we went through it on rules yesterday.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions from trustees? Any questions from members of the public on this specific agenda item?
Jill has her hand up.
I see a hand raised from Ms. Borders.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Councilmember Davis. That was a really succinct but very informative report, and I'm really grateful. It's very helpful to know dates of times that I can attend meetings with really important items like the budget. So thank you for that, and thank you for the information about the excess, and then also bringing up our law enforcement that I am so hoping we can make sure to continue to increase year after year our force. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Council Liederman. Are you on mute, Mr. Liederman?
Sorry about that. I was going to ask Councilmember Davis, has there been a change in the last week or two in the council's resolution regarding social distancing? And I was confused with whether or not going to voluntary mask mandate is a change in policy by the council, and whether that also affected the recommendation to maintain social distancing in city meetings.
We're still, thanks, Harvey. We are still doing remote meetings. So there hasn't been a change in policy. We're still doing remote meetings for committees. And we've asked that question of city staff, And the city manager's office has indicated that they think that we will be doing committee meetings remotely until after the July break, so that we would come back fully in person in August. However, we are currently meeting in the council chambers for council meetings on Tuesday for open session, not for closed session. And masks are encouraged but not required.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. I do, Council Letterman, I just want to let you know I attended the agenda review for the city yesterday for the meeting next week. And as part of one of the items that will be requested for approval is the AB 361. So at least I know the city staff intend to continue having the council approve the AB 361 at least at their April 26th meeting.
Great, thank you very much.
Any further questions for our city council liaison? Okay, thank you, Ms. Davis, and we will proceed to agenda item 5C. Discussion and action to authorize CEO to negotiate and execute a second amendment to the agreement with the Grant Thornton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the memo is pretty self-explanatory. I'm happy to answer any specific questions, but in a nutshell, this is the last year of Grant Thornton audit services running through June 30th, 2022. And if you go through the detail of the memo, it indicates that there have been some increases on the costs associated with the work. As it turns out, that will require us to approve the maximum contract amount this last year from $550,000 to about $40,000. We're asking for $50,000 just as a buffer. Doesn't mean that we will be spending the full amount, but just in case something else come up, we can't think of anything at this point. But in a nutshell, we're just recommending approval of an additional $50,000 increase so that they can complete their work for the final year of their audit. And we can have this relationship with Grant Thornton that has been actually a very productive and a positive one. I think they do excellent work, which is one of the reasons that we have agreed over the years to some of the requests on increase of their costs. Mind you, to some extent, the request has been considerably higher than the amounts that we have brought forward to you board in the past. But you know, we want to make sure, at least at that time, the last 2 or 3 years, we wanted to make sure that we had a good business relationship. So we were wanting to cover some of those additional costs, which actually brought the total cost to a little more than $550,000. I'm happy to answer any specific questions, but again, the recommendation is for your board to approve the additional increase.
Great, thank you, Mr. Pena. Are there any questions from trustees? Would someone like to formulate a motion?
As chairman of the audit committee, I would vote to approve or motion to approve.
Okay, we have a motion to approve from trustee Kelleher. Is there a second?
I'll second.
That's a second from trustee Linder. Any trustee discussion of this motion? Any public comments? So hearing none, we will have a roll call vote. Trustee Orr.
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings.
Aye.
Trustee Kelleher.
Aye.
Trustee Linder.
Aye.
Trustee Avasti. Trustee Avasti, are you on mute?
Aye.
And
Can you
I
hear me?
also, thank you. I also vote aye. So that passes unanimously. The motion is approved. See if we can complete the next agenda item 5D, which is discussion and action to authorize CEO to negotiate a third amendment to the agreement with Marty Boyer, our communications advantage consultant. I believe this is back to you, Mr. Pena.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just straightforward a request to extend the contract of our communication consultant for another fiscal year. We have enough funds in the original contract to cover the costs associated with their services for the upcoming fiscal year. So again, this is just a request to extend their services for the fiscal year 22-23.
Good, thank you. Are there any questions then about extending this service agreement? Do we have a motion to approve the extension of the service agreement?
So moved.
So we have a motion from trustee Linder. Do we have a second to that motion?
I'll second.
That's a second from Vice Chair Jennings. Any trustee comment? Any public comment? Hearing none, we will vote. Trustee Orr,
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings,
Aye.
Trustee Keller,
Aye.
Trustee Linder,
Aye.
Trustee Avasti,
Aye.
and I vote aye as well. Passes unanimously. The motion is approved. And on to the next agenda item, which is 5E. Discussion on the fiduciary insurance and waiver recourse fee for the policy year 2022-2023. And Mr. Pena, will you be addressing this?
Yes, I can. Thank God Benji is our accounting manager, and she actually is in attendance at the meeting. Can I have staff open the memo, please? Linda, is someone from staff can open the meeting, or would that be Benji? Do you know? Okay, so I'm not going to go into details. I think we actually at the last minute made some revisions to the memo, which I believe is self-explanatory. In a nutshell, this is fiduciary insurance for all the trustees for their work associated with the plans. The policy at this time by the board is that when there is a less than a 5% increase on the costs associated with this insurance, that the CEO can go ahead and sign up for another year and just notify the board of the decision. Having said that, however, I think Chair Horowitz very reasonably asked that we actually made this item a discussion and action, mostly because number one, it's an issue that only comes up once a year and is many times not well understood, but even by those trustees that have tenure at the board, but especially because we have recently added trustees, at least 2 of them in the last 6 months. So it's not only helpful to have a discussion, but also I think counsel, as part of his fiduciary education presentation later on, he will comment on that as well. In any event, there are 3 different types of insurance that we are requesting here. And the cost associated with that is the one that is explained in the memo. I'm happy to, well, I shouldn't say I'm happy because I don't know that I could answer those questions, but if you do have any questions, we will be happy to address them. Either Benji, who works more directly with the broker and has more knowledge of this area than me, or ultimately, Fiduciary Counsel, Harvey Littleman, also have information on it. This insurance does include a waiver of recourse fees, which is a total of $75 that need to be paid by each one of the trustees with a check payable to the city of San Jose. And that is because we have 3 separate insurances. It's $25 for each insurance. So with that, I'll leave it there. I'm sure there might be some comments or questions, and I'm hoping that, again, either staff can address them or Council Liederman can address them. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pena. I believe this is a discussion item. I don't know if it's discussion and action.
You may be right. I
So,
forgot
but
to say.
I did ask for it to be brought up as an agenda item, simply to highlight the fact that this is an important insurance protection for all trustees, and it is something that the trustees must pay for out of our own pocket. So I wanted to make sure all trustees were aware of that, and this protects us in the unlikely event that we are sued personally as trustees of the board for our volunteer activities.
Chairman Horowitz, I see that Jill Borders has her hand raised.
Thank you for pointing that out. And before I come to public comments, I wanted to ask if there were any questions or comments from the trustees themselves, and to make sure they are all aware of this impending deadline.
Well, I certainly would say that I'm more than happy to pay $75 for insurance. I will do my best to make sure that we don't have any problems, but in case that we do, it'd be nice to have that.
Right, but being fully aware that one could be sued even when one does one's best.
Yes.
So, and is in complete compliance with the law. And on that note, I see that Counsel Liederman has his hands up.
I just wanted to clarify, the cost of the insurance premiums are borne by the system.
Yes.
The $75 does not pay for the insurance coverage. What the $75 pays for is, as many of you know, when an insurance company agrees to start paying off a claim, they always do it with a reservation of rights that if it turns out later that it was not a covered claim, then they have recourse back against the individual that they advanced the money for to claw back, if you will, any amount that they paid that turns out was not covered claim under the policy. What this $75 does, and the reason why each trustee has to pay for it out of their own pocket, is it allows you to buy off that recourse. In other words, to prevent them, even if it turns out later that the insurance company didn't have to cover the claim, they can't come back against you personally to recover what they were out of pocket paying on your behalf. So for $25 on each policy, you buy off the right of the insurance company to claim recourse back against you personally. And that's they always price it at it's not priced like a premium. It's done more as a courtesy, essentially, almost to the trustees in these situations. So it's a very, very inexpensive way of buying you peace of mind that even if it turned out they didn't have to cover the claim, they will never be able to come back against you for reimbursement. So it's a very valuable item, but because it is of value to each trustee personally to protect your assets, the law says that kind of waiver of recourse has to be paid by you individually. The three policies that make up the fiduciary insurance, those premiums are significantly more, as you see from the second paragraph in this memo. But that is deemed to be a reasonable expense of administering the system. And the law specifically says that Federated, in this instance, can pay the premium for that insurance coverage. And so you have upwards of $10 million of insurance coverage that's paid for by Federated as a reasonable expense of administration that covers you for any acts you do as a fiduciary of the system. I hope that helps clarify what the $25 is for.
Yes, thank you very much for the more detailed clarification. It's still a very, very good benefit for the trustees, I believe. Trustee Avasti, you have your hand raised.
Yes, so is there any significant item that you can point us to which this fiduciary insurance does not cover?
Yes, it as most insurance policies, it would never cover some intentional wrongdoing on a part of a trustee that is outside the scope of your responsibilities. For example, if a fight were to break out on the dais, that's not going to work virtually, but if we were all back in a meeting in a room and a heated conversation were to happen between two trustees, by the way, this is not far-fetched. I've had it in other systems. And one trustee intentionally slaps another trustee, that would be considered an act out of the course and scope of the responsibilities of acting as a trustee. It would be a personal intentional tort, if you will, and the insurance would not cover you if the trustee who was slapped brought a personal lawsuit for battery, assault and battery against the offending trustee. The offending trustee would not be able to claim insurance coverage for that kind of an intentional wrongful act. Comes up oftentimes with boards, unfortunately, for acts such as workplace harassment or other intentional acts that are outside the scope of your responsibilities. And you would not have insurance coverage for that paid for by the system. Does that help to explain the difference?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Any further question from trustees? So as a clarification, Mr. Lederman, is it safe to say that any item that's on the agenda that we as trustees might vote on, that we are not liable for the results of those votes, which come up in the normal course of our agendized duties?
That's correct. That's correct. And I'll give you an example that happened to one of your other public systems here in the state of California, where the board made a decision. The actuaries for the system made mistakes. And the board made a decision after weighing all the facts, pro and con, not to sue, not to bring an action against the actuary for the mistakes. A retiree group decided to sue the board and sue the board members personally for making that decision. And that case went all the way to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals ruled that under the Constitution, boards like this board have to make these kind of discretionary decisions all the time. And as a consequence of that, you are not personally liable for making decisions in the course of running the business of a public employee pension fund. And making a decision whether to sue or not sue the actuary, for example, was a business decision that is well within the discretion of the board and therefore could not lead to personal liability of any board member. So that's an example. If you're doing make it real simple. If you're doing your job as a public employee pension fund trustee and fiduciary, you cannot be held personally liable for any decisions that you make in conducting your business. Now, saying that you can't be held personally liable doesn't mean you can't be sued, and that's why we have insurance. Mm-hmm. So that you don't have to look to your personal assets to go out and hire an attorney to defend you in that situation. That the system is providing you with the defense that you're entitled to at the system's expense or the insurance company's expense.
Okay, thank you. I think that was an especially helpful example of the kind of things that we are or not protected from. Any further questions from trustees? I see a member of the public has her hand raised to address this particular agenda item. Ms. Borders?
Thank you. Yes, just first and foremost, I think that when we're looking at these kinds of issues, there's this internal sort of justice and fairness topic that comes up. So I would say something like $75 for a volunteer position just to cover yourselves is ridiculous. So I would recommend or propose to the insurance company that it be more like, if it's just a placeholder, and if it's just a legal issue, then it should be $5, right? So it's just a placeholder, that $5 for each insurance company, total of $15. Everybody knows that that's just what that is. Second thing I would say is build in some sort of model for when you retire from the board, that is returned to you if it's just a placeholder. And the reason that I bring this up, it's so important to me, is I think we're being nickeled and dimed to death by these insurance companies. Drives me bananas. Kind of stand up for yourselves and say, I'm a volunteer. I mean, you are doing something that's necessary for the community, for your fellow co-employees that you worked with. You shouldn't have to pay a dime. We should be paying you. So second, I want to comment on the fact that the 5% that you mentioned in that letter, the CEO can just go ahead and, say that's fine. Well, it's coincidentally being raised 4.9%. So I would highly recommend you change it to 2.5%. And hopefully the next time the insurance company comes to you, you can say, okay, we'll take 2.5%. We have to start getting smarter and more ruthless because the numbers are getting larger and larger and larger. And 5%'s not a small number once you start adding this up, and insurance is just going to keep going up, and they're going to take whatever they can. So please consider changing that rule so that you can discuss it at the board, change it to 2.5 or 3% that the CEO is allowed to go ahead and, authorize that. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Borders. Any further comment from trustees or the public? If we can return to the agenda itself, I believe this is a discussion, no action. So no action is required, so there's no need for anyone to make a motion. And hopefully we are all aware now of the benefits of paying our annual fee here. The next item is fiduciary training from our general counsel. And as we've passed the 10 o'clock hour, I'd like to call a 5-minute recess, and we'll resume this lengthy topic when we return.
Mr. Chairman, would you like to deal with the committee assignments matter 5F before the break?
Oh, I missed that, but the answer is no. Let's deal with that after we return.
Gotcha.
So let's have a 5-minute recess and return at 10:10. Thank you. The next agenda item was 5F, discussion and action on committee assignments. If we can call up, yes, thank you, the current committee assignments. So all trustees are called upon to serve on one or more committees. We have 4 standing committees: the Investment Committee, the Audit Committee, Governance Committee, and Joint Personnel Committee. We have a new member of our board, Trustee Avasti, and we have one vacancy amongst the committee memberships, and that is the Audit Committee. So if I would like to propose that Ms. Avasti join the Audit Committee and help guide our overview of the audit function.
Yes, sure. I would be happy to join the audit committee.
Okay, do we need a motion by the full board to enact this, or is this something in the chair's prerogative?
If we need a motion, I certainly would so motion.
Good question. Why don't we do it by motion?
Okay, so we have a motion from Trustee Kelleher that Trustee Avasti be assigned to the Audit Committee, of which Trustee Kelleher is chair. Do we have a second to that motion?
Second.
We have a second from Trustee Linder. Is there any further discussion from trustees or the public? Hearing none, we will vote. Trustee Orr?
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings?
Aye.
Trustee Kelleher?
Enthusiastically, aye.
Okay. You still just get one vote. Trustee Linder?
Aye.
And Trustee Avasti?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. The motion carries, and welcome to your new committee assignment. Thank you. And now we're on to 5G, Annual Board Fiduciary Education, presented by General Counsel Liederman. So, Mr. Liederman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the board. We've sort of been postponing a little bit this annual presentation, so we got a full complement of the board, and we finally have. Even though Trustee Chandra can't be with us today, I'm delighted that we now have full 7 membership on the board, which is really important, as you can see, for the work, not only the board, but its committees as well. This is a smaller board than the police and fire board, and so each of you pick up a lot of responsibility. The conversation that we had just a few minutes ago about fiduciary insurance really highlights the role that you have as trustees, which are fiduciaries. We use the word fiduciary a lot, and part of what I want to be talking about is, what does that really mean to you? Because you should know that under the law, the fiduciary relationship is the highest level of trust and responsibility recognized under the law. The law recognizes people who have contractual obligations to each other. That's one thing. By contract, you have other obligations just as a human being not to do harm to other people. That's called tort relationship. The fiduciary relationship is a very unique and a very high level, the highest level of trust and responsibility that's recognized in law. And it recognizes the idea of, even the word fiduciary comes thousands of years from the root word, that same word is fidelity. It's a relationship of trust and confidence where others are putting their reliance upon you, their fiduciary reliance on you to act in their best interests. Unlike contract or tort, where you're acting in your own best interests and you hope those interests merge with people. In this situation, it's a responsibility of loyalty to carry out the benefits owed to others And so you're put in this role of trust and responsibility, which you take on and you take on voluntarily. But it's a very different kind of a relationship, and one that requires heightened duty of care and loyalty. And we'll talk about that. What I'd like to do is, if I may share my screen, I don't know who's in charge, Linda or Marty, or if you could let me share my screen. Let me know when that's possible, and I'll put my slide deck up.
You're able to share now.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can find that. Let's try that. And let me put that into.
Can you put it on full screen? I think.
I'm about to.
Okay.
How's that? Can you see that now?
Even I can see that.
This is not an eye test.
Oh, I thought it was. My mistake.
Okay, let's talk about over thousands of years of trust law, now reiterated in the state constitution and in the San Jose Municipal Code. These are what I've gelled down, the 5 fundamental fiduciary duties that board members have. Let's talk through them a little bit. The primary duty is one, as I was just talking about, is a duty of loyalty. You owe your primary duty to all the members and beneficiaries of this trust. Any other obligations that you have are to be subordinated to that. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, because the question is, how do you know when you're exercising your responsibility, your duty of loyalty to the members and beneficiaries of the system, and not, for example, to the city as the plan sponsor or to other stakeholders. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Second duty is what's called the exclusive benefit rule. And it's very simple. The assets of the pension fund are there for only 2 possible reasons. They're there to pay benefits that are earned by the members, and only reasonable expenses of administration. That's it. You're not allowed to use the assets of the system to accomplish anybody else's goals, to make investments that benefit other people. They are exclusively there to pay the benefits of the system. When you make, we talked about, I gave you an example when we were talking about fiduciary insurance, about the exercise of discretion. The law recognizes that if you're going to take on this kind of responsibility, and listen, you're pretty much volunteers in doing this. When you take on that kind of fiduciary responsibility, the law gives you broad discretion in which to exercise your judgment. And the irony here is that the key is that is not your personal exercise of judgment. It's how you all act together collectively to make decisions and exercise your judgment. And so the law imposes on you a duty of prudence. That's an elusive concept, but it's the idea that together you will exercise care and skill that an ordinary person with knowledge about the subject matter charged with the same responsibilities would do. It tries to create an objective standard. What would a reasonably prudent and careful trustee do under the circumstances? And the only time the law will upset your collective judgment is if the court is convinced that you have not acted prudently, that you've acted arbitrarily, that you've made a decision based on maybe just a knee-jerk reaction or for some other reason, or you've granted a disability, for example, or not granted a disability because you don't like the person, some arbitrary act that shows that you're not exercising care and skill of a knowledgeable person, acting prudently. So that's when you have broad discretion to make judgment calls, but they have to be prudent judgment calls and actually show the exercise of judgment, not just acting arbitrarily and capriciously for reasons that are unrelated to the trust. The fourth fundamental duty, and this is really a policy-based duty. We talk about it all the time. There's literally written into the state constitution that charters your actions. Modern portfolio theory, the idea that a broadly diversified portfolio is a prudent thing in which to steward the assets of a system like this. That you have an obligation to diversify the portfolio broadly, unless in a particular situation, it would be imprudent to diversify the investments. And that's why we spend so much time talking about asset allocation and broad asset classes and subclasses. We're really carrying out this fiduciary responsibility because as a matter of public policy, it's been determined that the best risk-reward balance that you can achieve with public pension assets is through a diversified portfolio. And we talk about the efficient frontier and are you going to be compensated for the risk that you take? All of that falls into this diversification obligation. And the final thing is that may sound simple, but it's tough sometimes. And that is you have a fiduciary obligation to follow the law. And the law in this instance is the state constitution, the city law of the city of San Jose, the Internal Revenue Code. Remember, we administer a tax qualified public employee pension plan. We are exempt from governance under federal law. We're exempt from taxes on the contributions that are made by the members and on the earnings of this system. In exchange for that, the IRS extracts an obligation from us that says, you have an obligation as a trustee to follow your plan documents. And the plan documents are all the governing instruments of this system. It can be our bylaws, it can be our policies and charters of committees, these and the law itself. So we have an obligation to follow the plan documents. If we don't follow the plan documents, the IRS has the right to pull our tax qualified status or penalize us for not doing that. And that would not be an appropriate use of the assets of the system, going back up to the exclusive benefit rule right here. Paying taxes on the system is not using the assets only to pay benefits and reasonable administrative expenses. So these are the 5 fundamental fiduciary responsibilities you have. And what I did is I put them on this slide just under pillars, mainly because I wanted to ask if anybody knows what kind of columns these are. Remember from school?
Roman.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Who said Corinthian?
That was Trustee Kelleher.
There you go.
Excellent. All right. No, it wasn't easy to find these. But anyway, this is as graphic as I get as a lawyer. So this is it. This is the animation that you're going to get in this slide deck. So enjoy it. But I wanted to gang. So under each pillar, if you will, under each fiduciary responsibility, I kind of ganged some things that, that sort of belong in that. For example, under loyalty to members, we're going to talk about conflicts of interest in avoiding wearing 2 hats. When you come to this board, you only wear a single hat, and that is the representation of what is in the members' best interest. But also part of your loyalty to members includes attracting and retaining capable staff and providing superior member service and minimizing the risk of loss to the system, because that does not inure. So you don't get to go out and gamble with the assets. When it was 1984, by the way, when pension trustees in California were first allowed to invest in the equity markets. Before that, you'd just be clipping bonds. And you saw that slide from Laura Wyrick and Makita earlier that we look at. You know, back in the 80s, it was easy to meet your investment return target by simply collecting bond coupons. Not so anymore. But in 1984, the legislature allowed, for the first time, investment in the equity markets. But that's when they also put in the Constitution that the obligation was to minimize employer contributions. And that didn't mean that we had an obligation to keep contribution rates low. It meant that we could not gamble with the assets in the equity market. There was a great fear that we would take on outsized risks as pension, now that we could invest in the equity markets. And it was constantly had to be reined in by balancing risk with expected reward. So that became part of the loyalty to members. Using the assets we've talked about, it's important to understand whenever we approve a contract, for example, like we did earlier today, whether they're extensions or the auditor's contract, we have to ask ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, is this a reasonable expense of administering the fund? Should we pay additional amounts in, do we get the bang for the buck that we're supposed to be getting? If it's not, and I think we had this conversation as well. Some of you raised the issue when we were talking about the healthcare trust as to whether or not the transaction costs justified moving to Mix A, for example. That's part of constantly thinking about, are we paying reasonable expenses to administer the fund? Because that's part of knowing that the assets are being used for the benefit of the members. Prudent care really goes to our governance policies, how we manage ourselves, how we create a record that we're exercising discretion and good judgment under the circumstances. The things that we do to be transparent, to have our board meetings open and open to public comment, for example. And we've taken some good steps to encourage that recently. Prudent care of a $5 billion pension fund also includes the board delegating responsibility to staff and consultants. This is a board of 7 people charged with stewarding a few $1 billion of assets of other people's money. You meet once a month, only for 11 months, actually. 1 month you don't meet in July. It would not be prudent, it would not be possible for this board to run this pension fund to the benefit of members 1 day a month in exercising your own judgments, despite many of you having expertise in investments, for example. You could not do it, meeting once a month. And the only way you can accomplish this in a prudent manner is to engage knowledgeable staff, knowledgeable consultants to help carry out the responsibilities of the board. That is part of the exercise of prudent care and expertise. And then you monitor what they do and evaluate what they do. And you evaluate your CIO and CEO annually and staff, and they evaluate staff. So this is all part of a prudent process that fiduciaries are required to follow. Talked a little bit about diversifying assets. You have to establish not your own personal risk tolerance, but collectively how this board is going to anticipate the risk-reward balance. And then you need to weigh each investment for its contribution to the whole program. This is key to fiduciary prudence, The idea being that some assets that you're selecting for diversification and downside risk mitigation purposes, not for the returns, the absolute returns that you may get from that particular asset class. And so you look at the value of your assets through diversification as how they contribute to the whole risk reward expectation that you have for the assets of the system. That's part of diversifying the assets. And then following the law we talked about is it's just required that you follow your plan documents and that you have plan documents, including the law that tells you what you're supposed to do. These boards have been created not to be in the plan design business, but to be in the plan implementation business. The plan design comes from, in the case of the city of San Jose, from the city and the voters of the city. They will tell you what the benefit level should be, how long it takes to be qualified, to be vested to receive a benefit, who's entitled to get a disability allowance and under what circumstances. These are all in the plan documents. They're not with your responsibility. I mean, this should give you some relief that it's not up to you to design this plan. It's up to you to carry it out. You're the trustee, not the trustor. Okay, the city is the trustor. And they've created the trust with the terms of what the city and its unions and its employees should get in terms of benefits. And then it's our obligation to carry that plan out for the benefit of the members and beneficiaries of the system. And the last point I want to make on this in terms of following the law is, unlike your counterparts in private company pension funds, like 401k funds or other defined contribution funds, you are public officials. In the private pension fund context, they don't have the added obligation of being a public official. You all swear and take an oath to uphold the law and to discharge your responsibilities fairly and appropriately. And as a public official, you have a little bit added obligation to keep in mind the public welfare. And this comes up from time to time, and we'll talk about it, but it's an additional obligation that you have that your counterparts in private pension funds do not have. And it's simply I put this down as a marker for you to keep in mind that you're acting as a public official, which in my view is a even heightened level of public trust in how you conduct yourselves as fiduciaries of the system. The biggest implication of that is to avoid conflicts of interest. And conflicts of interest come up all the time. They're not just, do you have a personal interest? For example, is your spouse a partner at Grant Thornton? So when you consider the auditing contract of Grant Thornton, do you have a personal interest through your spouse in that contract? That would just sort of be a classic conflict of interest where you would be torn between your interests as a trustee and whether or not it's a good contract to approve for the system, and your loyalty to your spouse and, gee, would this be good for their compensation, for example. That's kind of a classic conflict of interest. And we got plenty of laws on all that. And if you have any doubt about it, just reach out, call Maytak or myself or Roberto and raise the issue about whether or not you have a personal conflict of interest. because this is the key part of the loyalty obligation, is to represent the interests of all the members of the system and not be torn by other interests that you may have. There's one other point I want to make about conflicts of interest. Each of you becomes a member of this board in different ways. Some of you are appointed by the city council. I guess you're all put on by the city council, but Mark, for example, is that a hand up, Mark? Oh, okay.
No.
Mark, oh, I'm sorry, Mark Linder. Mark Linder, for example, comes to the board via a retiree vote, if you will. Some of the others of you who are active employees, Julie, for example, Avasti, for example, come to this board because of your relationship as an active employee of the city. How you get on the board, however, has nothing to do with what you do once you're on the board. This is not Congress. You don't represent a district. Your job is not to bring home the pork for your district. These plans in California have been intentionally created to have a broad diversity of the methods by which you get on the board, but with a recognition that once you're on the board, you're not representing those interests. You're not serving those interests. You're serving the interests of all the members of the system. And so your job, no matter how you get on the board, is to act collectively for the best interests of everybody in the system. And so that is also the root of potential conflicts of interest. Because many of you, especially those who come via the membership, for example, active or retired members of the system, spend a lot of time talking with your constituents. And we use that word constituents to denote the people who put you on the board. But you don't represent their interests in coming to this board. Once you're on the board, you have to take that hat off and put on the hat of what's in the best interests of everybody in the system. And that leads me to this other illustration, because we talk a lot about who are our stakeholders, do we have a responsibility to stakeholders? And I've tried to outline here on this target for you the relative relationships here, because it's only that yellow bullseye target that you have an obligation towards. This is sometimes very difficult to understand, but your job, first and foremost, your duty of loyalty as a fiduciary is to the members and the beneficiaries of the system, and not to anyone else. There are other stakeholders, other people who have an interest in what we do on this board. It can be the city of San Jose that makes contributions and employs all of our members at one time or another. There are retiree organizations, there are unions. The general public and the taxpayers have interests in our system. Even so far as consultants and vendors, we're all stakeholders. I'm a stakeholder in this system because I'm under contract providing services to you. But you don't owe me a fiduciary. In fact, I owe you a fiduciary responsibility. You only owe a fiduciary obligation to the bullseye target, the members and beneficiaries of the system. Any other obligations that you feel to others have to be subordinated to the interests of the members. It's a big ask, but I wanted to give you a graphic explanation of that.
You have
Yes,
another
Julie.
graphic here, okay? You told me you didn't, only one, right? But here's
Well,
another one.
I had to hold something back for surprise.
Yeah, this is good. I like,
It's
you know.
not
I really-
animated though. I haven't figured out how to animate. I could have done a fly-in, you know, but this is PowerPoint 101 as best I can do.
I like it. I like it.
But hopefully it gives you a tangible image in your mind when thinking about who do I owe my responsibility to. So I want to give you, I put together 10 fiduciary commandments that take it out of the abstract and put it into something that maybe you can get your arms around. Obviously, the first one is adhere to your fundamental fiduciary duties. It's a little abstract, but we've talked about it. Second, obeying conflict of interest laws. But the rest of these are conduct type, you know, reminders. Avoid activities that improperly influence your judgment or are inconsistent with your duty to act in the best interest of all members. And this could even be, you know, meeting, for example, discussing the business of the board with other groups and listening to them. And we'll talk about some of those decisions that you make that are tough. But you don't want to appear to be prejudiced or biased in any way in how you conduct yourself on the board. If you have a conflict of interest, number 4, you should disclose it. And if necessary, you have to recuse yourself from participating. We will do another program on conflicts of interest because it's too much to get into in this one sitting. But I want to do another program for you on conflicts of interest so that you get a better idea about the pitfalls that could befall you and how to handle those when they come up. There are laws that impose legal limits on gifts, receiving things of value. There's always a temptation, especially when you're at conferences, for example, and the money managers are all over you because you're a decision maker and they want you to hire them to run money of the pension fund, that they're going to try to, in one way or another, treat you to meals, treat you to a golf tournament, take you on a trip somewhere. These are items of value that you cannot accept, and there's very little tolerance for these kind of things. You need to be very careful with the legal limits on those. Another, again, fairness obligation is honoring the quiet period during manager and vendor searches. This is, again, to avoid prejudice and bias. If you don't honor the quiet period, you reach out, you talk to a service provider or something like that outside the RFP process, for example, you're telegraphing to other vendors and managers that it's not a level playing field. And that can really kill your opportunities to hire the best and the brightest in the future. Because if people get if this system were to get the reputation that during an RFP process, the fix could be in for one particular manager or vendor, then you're going to stop getting competitive bids from others. And that's happened in other systems, by the way. And it takes years to overcome that kind of reputation. Number 7, you need to avoid using your public position for private gain or influence. We have had pension trustees and other systems spend a lot of time, especially in the investment world, developing information and using staff, for example, to develop information that they are then going to use in their private business. That is a conflict of interest that needs to be avoided. Our closed sessions, again, this is a manner of carrying yourself as a fiduciary. Our closed sessions are confidential. There's an obligation that they must remain confidential. Don't make our closed sessions leaky situations where as soon as you get out, you pick up the phone and call somebody at the union, or you call somebody at the city hall and say, wow, we just made a decision to do X, Y, and Z. I want you to know about it. Can't do that. One of the big reasons you can't do that is maintaining confidentiality is critical to maintain a level of trust and respect among yourselves. Remember, you're making collective decisions, and you really are fiduciaries to each other. And if you don't believe you can trust each other, then you're not going to be able to make prudent decisions about how to steward this fund. So these kind of things engender respect among board members, as well as respect for those you're serving. Part of that also is conducting yourself with civility and respect at board meetings. I will tell you that, 10, 12 years ago, when the markets were in the dumper and funds were losing asset value in the Great Recession, that the level of civility and respect among boards like this was seriously compromised. People's feelings were running high. People were upset with each other. Very little business got done because people on boards like this couldn't get along together. Fortunately, in better times, that's resolved itself. We've never had that kind of issue here. But I've had other state boards that I work with have board members who actually attack each other physically during board meetings and file police reports against each other. It's very difficult to get the work of a board done in that kind of an atmosphere. The final point I want to make here is it's very important that when you're communicating with others, that you're careful in what you say, that you don't represent your personal views as if they were the views of this board. Again, it's a matter of respect to the board and not misleading the membership. So you just need to be careful when you communicate with members. You need to be careful that, for example, and I know those of you who are active or retired members of the system, of the board, you'll get people call you and say, shouldn't I be entitled to get a service-connected disability because, I was hurt doing X, Y, and Z. And you're tempted to say, well, of course, let me see what I can do for you. But you need to be really careful doing that because we have processes in place that will determine whether that person is entitled to a disability retirement. And you don't want to put yourself out on a limb by assuring them one way or another that that's what they're entitled to. This is not an easy job to do, as you probably surmise and know by now. There are going to always be hot button. Oh, I've got another picture in here, Julie. There's always going to be
a hot button. There you go.
It's a hot button.
And it's
There's always going to be some hot button issues that come up. Obviously, one of the hottest of the hot button issues that this board deals with, and most boards deal with, are the funding decisions. You talk all the time about what is the appropriate assumed rate of return and the discount rate. And that can impact the city's bottom line directly and impact the employees' contribution rates. That's really a hot button issue. And when you're making those decisions, we need to keep coming back to what's in the best interest of the long-term funding of this system for the members of the system. Not, oh my God, what's the impact going to be on the city's budget? We can take that into account, but that's not your first and foremost obligation. The city has designed the plan. The city has negotiated the level of benefits that it's going to offer. And your job is to fund those benefits. And the impact on the city's budget has to be secondary to your obligation to make sure that the funds are there to pay the benefits in a timely manner. It's a tough job to do. We often have controversial laws that we have to deal with that maybe seem unfair in terms of benefit administration. But our job, again, I'll make that point again, is our job is to implement the plan design, not to decide as a matter of policy that we like or don't like the plan design. Delegating authority to staff is always a tough issue for a board to do. How much to have the fingers off of what staff is doing, particularly on the investment side. Another hot button issue is we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. Everything from the fossil-free movement to the last slide I'll talk about here in the deck. Diversity and inclusion policies.
So, Counselor?
Yes.
Just a quick question.
Absolutely.
Why is integrating ESG into investment decisions controversial?
Well, it's controversial because the board, a board in determining that it's going to consider issues like this in constructing its portfolios has to first, in my view, come to the determination that there is a rational and logical nexus, if you will, a connection between, let's take an environmental issue and the financial performance of the portfolio. So, for example, this comes up all the time now, especially now with, well, let me take one that's not quite so currently in vogue, which is the divestment from fossil fuel companies. But let's take, we went through this a few years ago, investments in private prisons. There was a movement to get pension funds to cease their investing in companies that run private prisons for policy reasons. Okay, so the question becomes, if your primary obligation is to fund the retirement system, is there a nexus, is there a connection between investing in private prisons and risks, for example, to the portfolio that presents? Because if you're only doing it as a policy matter, if you're saying, I'm going to no longer diversify a portion of my portfolio into a particular sector of the economy, but I'm going to do that because as a matter of public policy, I don't like them, I don't like that sector, then you're not putting the performance of the fund first and foremost. You're attempting to accomplish another public policy goal. See what I'm saying? With, for example, let's take fossil fuels. I think that'll help. There is obviously a current movement to ask retirement systems, retirement boards, to divest holdings in the biggest polluters based on fossil fuel, whether it's fossil fuel extraction or transportation or whatever it is, because it's a harmful industry, arguably, that will hurt the welfare and lead to climate change and adverse effects. The funds that have successfully integrated that issue have done so based on findings that continuing to invest in these companies poses an outsized risk to their portfolio in the future, whether it's due to the impact of climate change or supply chains or any number of things, that they have found that there is a logical relationship between investing in these type of companies in this sector and the likely risk that it poses to the portfolio, for which you will not be compensated. And therefore, it is permissible, or it is acceptable to divest holdings in this particular sector, the fossil fuel extraction sector, for example, or thermal coal, for example, because they pose outsized risks to the portfolio in the future. And so if you make that determination, if the board were to make a determination that continuing to invest in ExxonMobil, for example, poses risks that you're not going to be compensated for in the future, then the board can integrate that kind of a consideration into its investment decisions and satisfy its fiduciary responsibility as a steward of the assets of the system. That's is a long way of trying to respond to your question, but it's a complicated question. And we haven't yet had this conversation, I think, at the board yet. But
Counsel, that was very helpful. I would be curious if we are investing in privately owned jails, or just how much exposure we have to oil and things like that.
Yeah. But that's really,
I think that's just a question for Prabhu.
Yeah, thank you, Trustee Kelleher. We will get back to you with the data on that. I don't believe we are investing in privately held prisons, but I will double check with Dinesh and get back to the board with that information.
Thank you.
The prisons was a big issue at the state level. And another one like that is illegal handgun manufacturers and distributors. Many boards wrestled with the issue of do they hold interests, especially private equity interests in manufacturers and distributors of illegal weapons, and should they consider to continue to do that? So these issues come up. In fact, why don't we get really controversial and go to my last slide? Because there is now pending in the state legislature, and it's been signed off by almost every member of the state Senate as a sponsor, a legislation to cause pension funds to divest from any holdings or any company that does business in Russia or Belarus. And what that bill says, this is—
I think you mean active.
What's that?
Active business.
Active business, that's right.
Yeah.
And
otherwise. Yeah.
Senate Bill 1328 is the bill. It's in the Appropriations Committee right now. It's moving quickly, and it's listed as an urgency bill, so it'll become law soon if it passes and gets signed into law. And basically what it says is that California pension funds, not San Jose, because this is a charter city fund, and for better or for worse, we're excluded from the coverage of the rest of the pension funds, public pension funds in California under this bill. But basically it would require pension funds to stop investing in businesses or hiring companies as vendors, for example, that have active business operations in Russia, unless they take what's called substantial action to stop those operations. Now, this is basically would be every company in the Fortune 500 and beyond. It would be McDonald's, it would be Starbucks, it would be ExxonMobil, it would be Koch Industries, it would be you name it. Because all these companies, all these listed companies that we hold positions in, both in active and passive indexes, unless they were to take substantial action to stop their activities in Russia, we would have to divest from holdings in them. We'd have to also hire research companies to analyze them. I say we, the funds that are prohibited, state level and county funds and other city funds. The real key here, however, and why this is a teachable moment for us, whether or not it's going to impact San Jose or not, is that there's this what's called a savings clause. And it says the board doesn't have to do any of this unless it determines that divestment from these companies is consistent with its fiduciary duties. And that will trigger this conversation and the question, so is it consistent? Would it be consistent with your fiduciary duty to stop investing in 400 of the Fortune 500? What impact would that have on our portfolio?
So I would be interested in hearing our Chief Investment Officer Polani's view on this. Like, how disruptive would something like this be?
Yeah, no, thanks.
And let's deal with this on a purely hypothetical level,
Yes.
since nobody's really studied this at this point.
Yeah, and Trustee Kelleher, specifically, you're talking about Russia or in general, these kinds of restrictions?
In general, because it's going to come up again, I'm sure.
So since this is all very hypothetical, I'm going to give a, so the way I see my duty and our duty, and Counsel Lederman can correct me if I'm mistaken, is our job is to maximize our risk-adjusted returns. And our job is to make sure that our pensioners get paid, right? And for that, we need to have the full set of investments that are available to be able to produce those returns. And if I'm able to pay my pensioners, and then they can vote with their dollars if they get their monthly pension checks, then people can have their own pet projects, right? And you can boycott Starbucks, you can boycott Russia, you can choose to spend your pension dollars as you please. But if we start limiting our ability to invest, that is going to cost us returns, right? And especially, so I think Russia is a smaller issue, given that we have such a small weight in Russia and Ukraine. And this is not to minimize the human tragedy that's happening in Russia or elsewhere. But then if you start extending these things, right? And then people have pet projects and pet social costs. I believe this happened at CalPERS a few years ago, that either the state treasurer or one of the CalPERS board members said we should divest from Cyprus. I don't know. And so one of these countries was blacklisted, right? And so you can have council members, board members, stakeholders then come up with a list of things that they dislike, right? And this will greatly reduce the universe of investments that are available to us. And as we all know, the greater the universe of investments and opportunities, the easier it is for us to pick and produce good returns. And so I and my team and I, we always think that our duty is to maximize our risk-adjusted return for our pensioners, and that's how we approach this. And anything beyond that, every restriction that you put, it costs a burden. It's a burden not just in terms of monitoring these things, but also I think it does take away returns. And I would say, look, I'm when it comes to climate change, I have personal views. I think we should be carbon free and all of that. And I drive an electric vehicle as well. But that's different from what I do here with our pension plans, right? In fact, one could argue that you have to take the opposite end of the trade on fossil fuels, right? If everyone's dumping that, maybe it's a good time to buy it because they're suddenly selling cheap, right? And that's what we are looking for. We're always looking for value-added opportunities in our investment portfolio. So every restriction that's put is a cost in terms of return, in terms of due diligence, in terms of investment time for monitoring these things. So that's just my personal view on this.
Thank you very much.
You can see there's no answer specifically to any of this, but there are considerations, and it's part of the exercise of prudence is to have this conversation when it comes up, look at the data, get the advice of your investment consultants in this instance, for example, about the markets and what the future markets are going to look like, and then make an informed decision. You're never going to be held to be a guarantor of the outcome of that decision, whether it's going to be good or bad for the system. What you're all going to be held to is, did you arrive at a decision in a prudent, intelligent, and skillful manner? And that's the takeaway from this today, is that process by which the board acts is as important, if not more important, than the results of the board's determination. So I'm going to conclude it with that. And Mr. Chairman, if there are questions from the board or further discussion, let's have at it, but I'm all out of pictures.
I do see a question from Jill.
I'll stop my sharing. I'll stop my sharing at this point.
That's good. Spencer, you're muted.
Thank you. Getting a bunch of phone calls while that was going on. I have a question for Counsel Liederman, but I'll turn first to trustees to see if you have any further questions on this very delicate subject.
I don't have a question, sir, but I just thought it was a really excellent presentation, and I thank him for that.
Yes, thank you. And it's extremely important, and the devil is in the details. So given that last hypothetical, well, it's not so much hypothetical, the proposed state law actually has 2 outs for our particular pension plan. But what if there were no outs? What if, for instance, our sponsor, the city of San Jose, passed an ordinance that directly prohibited us from investing in companies that do business in Russia? Would we be obligated to follow that, or would our fiduciary duty to maintain access to the full universe of assets lead us to reject that ordinance? How would we split the difference in that very direct conflict?
Well, if you'd like me to respond to that, Mr. Chairman, I'd say we would schedule a closed session conversation about that.
Okay. I think that tells me what I need to know, I think. But clearly it would be a difficult discussion. So.
It would be a long drawn discussion, I imagine. I mean, my 2 cents on this is I first thank you, Harvey. That was really a very broad and deep presentation, and much appreciated, because it's always good to revisit and sort of rethink scenarios, and just how can we improve our behaviors and remind ourselves our obligations in the public domain. When I think about ESG or Russia or these issues, they're so complex that they shouldn't be any easy answer. So we'll put our heads together at that time. The one thing I do want to share is that I think about Russia and what it means to seek maximum returns, right? So obviously there could be very extreme, highly risky, extremely high return opportunities for the plan if we were to pursue such in a hypothetical manner. But then we'd have to balance that off in some way. And I don't think there's any particular policy that lets us measure against what it means to be in possibly, the midst of an immense amount of human suffering and murder. So, again, there's no perfect balance, but I want to just highlight that, yes, our role is to maximize returns, but there has to be a line that we might have to identify to demarcate what is what is ethically and financially appropriate. So I'll just leave that there.
And that
I would
is
agree
the-
with that,
That is the
trustee
struggle.
Orr, that we have to balance not only our fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiaries, but also just a moral obligation.
And that's why I tried to indicate to you that there's not an absolute answer to those difficult questions, particularly for those of us who serve in the public sector. We have that additional obligation to the public welfare and how we operate. And so there is nothing but gray area in these kind of determinations, and boards struggle with them, and rightly so. It should be a struggle. It shouldn't be an easy answer one way or the other, but we will face these, and they will test your fiduciary mettle from time to time. And I would expect that San Jose will be no different than most other systems in that regard.
So, Chairman Horowitz, I am interested in hearing what Ms. Borders has to say.
Yes, well, I was giving all trustees an opportunity to speak first. So if there are any other trustees who wish to raise questions or issues on this subject, but if there are none, let us hear what the public has to say on this specific agenda item. Ms. Borders, your hand is raised.
Thank you so much. I also want to chime in and say how wonderful that educational presentation was. So Mr. Lederman, I was so impressed and inspired even, and felt a bit like it was a dose of confidence I needed that, we have these ethical, things in place. So I am just impressed. And so thank you for that. I learned so much. I'm so glad this is being recorded because I'm going to go back and listen to it again. I also think that, and maybe you already know this, but this could certainly be a presentation that so many people need to see. They need to know that that all of you are actually bound by these types of amazing parameters that are set up for you. I loved the 10 Commandments. That was fabulous. Amazing. I just want to thank you. It was amazing. So, but the second thing I want to say is how much courage it apparently takes to take on these positions that you all have as trustees. And the little that I've learned over these meetings that I've attended, I just want you all to know that I admire you, and I encourage you to keep at it. One of my pillars in life is to try to become much more civically engaged. And in addition to that, to learn as much as I can whenever I can. And so to come on here at a public meeting and for free receive this type of education and be inspired, and then to know that all of you take on this risk. You have to pay now $75 and all of your time. Anyway, I just want to thank you. This is a fabulous educational presentation, and I also admire all of you for taking on this this role. Thank you.
Okay,
I would like to thank you, Jill, as well as Brad, for being participants in this process. So thank you very much.
Yes, we certainly appreciate those words, Ms. Borders. Our sense of public thanks is not always highly present, so it's very gratifying to hear those words. Are there any other comments, questions from either the public or from trustees?
Mr. Chair, neither public trustee staff, I do have one question for counsel, if you don't mind.
Okay, I think we can take one from staff.
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me just say, counsel has been doing this job for a long, long time. Probably I started when I was a little kid. I've been in the retirement arena, public arena for some 25 years, and trust me, the job has gotten a lot more challenging, especially for trustees. So kudos to all of you for putting the time and effort and doing this job. I wanted to ask Harvey, you did mention, Harvey, that later you will have another presentation on conflict of interest. which is in itself is a particular area that we need to emphasize. But in that last slide that you mentioned, I wanted to ask you if somewhere in those presentations you can also add some education to the trustees on the different implications of following the laws, right? Because as you mentioned, we're a city charter, and then there's the municipal code, then there's the state code, there's the county code, there's a federal law, and so it's not easy to really manage all those things together. And when do we have to pay attention to them or not? I recognize that even when there are particular areas or laws that don't particularly, say, for example, like PEPRA, impact the city of San Jose, we should always, we as in the board and staff, always keep in mind that on the back of our head, because it will be used to determine the reasonableness of the decision making and the process that we implement. I grant you that I don't do an excellent job at it. I try in my own board of trustees to sort of explain a little bit about it, but obviously law is not my background. And so I just wanted to raise this issue so that when you get a chance, you can bring that also as part of your education to trustees, because it's not easy to know when particular areas impact you directly, and even when they do not, why is it important to keep that in mind? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole fabric of laws and rules and regulations that get triggered, and we try every time an issue comes up. You know, part of our responsibility to you is to give you the peripheral vision into all the applicable laws, whether they're tax or municipal code or state laws, internal revenue requirements. We want you to have the full knowledge of that entire fabric that impacts your decision making at the time. So we will try to give you, it's almost like filing an environmental impact report. We try to give you a legal impact report that accompanies any decisions that you're making, so that you have that vision and know that you're stepping inside the chalk lines, if you will, and not going out of bounds. So we'll continue to do that. Conflicts of interest are some of the more specific things, because it really gets into things like, do you have an interest that is more than $2,000 a year, or how much, can you accept a gift from a friend who happens also to be a money manager for the system, and can you give a wedding present to somebody who is, X, Y, and Z? There's a lot of granular rules that relate to public officials and conflicts of interest, and it's a minefield. Those of you who have ever run for public office know that about the campaign finance laws, and I applaud anybody who ever runs for office and can get through that without getting slapped on the wrist or fined, because it's a minefield of minutia. It's not quite so bad with conflicts of interest, but there's just a whole bunch of things. And what you have to keep in mind, Roberto, on conflicts, for example, is how would it read, above the fold? I guess nobody has a newspaper anymore. How would it look how would it look if what's being proposed would be the headline in the Mercury News tomorrow? And to kind of give you, what would it look like to the general public if the public knew what you were doing or what was being proposed? Would it be acceptable behavior? And that's kind of the talisman you sort of have to go by, because we can fill in the granular details, but if you accept a golf outing gift from a money manager of the system, what would Ms. Borders say about that if she knew about that? And that's kind of the test that we keep in front of ourselves all the time. Not to put any burden on Ms. Borders, however.
Thank you, Counsel. Again, I recognize conflict of interest is in itself a very particular section. I was just making the point that in the future education, you can address the other issues, because I'm afraid I don't do a very good job in the onboarding process because I don't have your background. So that will be helpful. That's all. But thank you very much for the explanation.
Okay, I don't think there's any action on this particular agenda item. And therefore we can move forward to 5H, discussion and action on the factual findings for AB 361. So I believe Mr. Liederman, you will guide us through this one.
Yeah, and before you do, Counsel, I just wanted to mention in my other report, I actually misspoke. This AB 361 will be going to the City Council at the May 3rd meeting, not the April 26th, but they have it for approval at the May 3rd meeting, just so you know.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't need to say much. You have before you a memorandum that we've prepared outlining the factual findings that continue to exist, that allow us to be able to continue invoking AB 361's relaxed teleconference rules under the Brown Act. And those two findings appear. They are that the governor's, the emergency declaration continues in effect relating to COVID-19 and impact the ability of this board to be able to safely meet in public. Further, the City Council on April 5th, I think that's the most recent action by the City Council, continued its declaration to recommend the wearing of masks and social distancing for boards such as ours. And so what we need, Mr. Chairman, unless there are further questions, is a motion to adopt those findings and to continue meeting for another 30 days, which is the maximum that we can schedule. Another 30 days meeting virtually rather than in person.
Thank you, Council Liederman. So under AB 361, this board as a legislative body must make certain factual findings if it elects to continue meeting virtually within the next 30 days. Based on the information presented by Council and provided with our board backup materials, it appears that the following factual findings justify the continuation of virtual meetings under AB 361. 1, the governor's proclamation of a state of emergency continues due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And 2, the San Jose City Council's recent resolution continues to impose or recommend measures to promote social distancing in city facilities. Do I hear a motion to adopt these two factual findings for the election to use AB 361's abbreviated teleconferencing procedure for the next 30 days for this board?
I so motion.
We have a motion from Vice Chair Jennings. Do we have a second?
I will second the motion, Trustee Kelleher.
We have a second from Trustee Kelleher. Public discussion. Is there any public discussion by trustees? And
Jill has her hand up.
Yeah, and we have a hand raised from a member of the public, Ms. Borders.
Thank you. I do hope that you will all pass this. I have a feeling you will. But I do want to just comment. I really hope that someone is considering on how we can continue to have everything be continuing like this online. And I will tell you why. Obviously, I'm attending here and have interest in this. I would most likely not be able to attend if you meet in person someday. And I do think that it has inspired in me, given me the confidence in trusting this body. So I just want to, for the record, say that if you continue to have meetings online and people attend, and for example, after viewing Mr. Liederman's educational slideshow, which was fabulous, it really did inspire me and taught me a lot. And has increased my level of trust. And so that's one thing I'm really working on. So if you might just consider that in your vote, and in the future to have meetings online, I think that one of our goals as a city, as residents, and as elected officials, we should be trying to improve this trust with the public that we seem to have lost. So I'm all for this. I hope we will continue this into the future, even past COVID. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree.
Any further comment from trustees or the public?
I would also agree with Jill
Yes.
Borders, Ms. Borders and Julie Jennings, that we want to be as transparent as possible. We do have a very, very important role that we play, and we want to be as transparent as possible and make sure that everything is accessible as possible. But we will need to follow the law and City Council's guidance.
Mhm.
Okay, if there are no further comment, we will have a roll call vote to continue to meet under AB 361's abbreviated teleconferencing procedure for the next 30 days. Trustee Orr, how do you vote?
Aye.
Vice Chair Jennings?
Aye.
Trustee Kelleher?
Aye.
Trustee Linder?
Aye.
Trustee Avasti?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. It passes, and we will continue to meet under the AB 361 guidance. We now move on to committee reports. 6.1, the Investment Committee. Committee Chair Chandra is not here to report. I believe I was the only other member on the last meeting, which was simply a special meeting to continue AB 361 procedures. So other than that, there's nothing to report. Governance Committee. That's Chair Jennings.
We have nothing to report.
Okay, it looks like your last meeting was also a special meeting and your next one is also a special meeting. The
Yes.
Audit Committee.
So nothing to report. We had a special meeting on April 14th where we extended AB 321, and we have a meeting shortly after this. So nothing to report.
Okay, thank you. And Joint Personnel, Committee Chair Orr.
Nothing specific to report. Council Leaderman was kind enough to highlight that we will need to meet in person at some point if we are to address the special meeting governance rules with AB 361. So once we sort that out, we'll be able to report back on scheduling of the next meeting and content.
Thank you, Chair. Or I just wanted to just bring this up in public. I'm working with Prabhu, trying to understand when the information in reference to the compensation work by the two consulting firms may be available for discussion, because that will have a direct impact as to when the committee may need to meet next time. So we're trying to sort that out, get a sense on what that may be available, so then we can work backwards and see when we can meet so that we can have that meeting that you mentioned, Trustee, or in person, just to approve the AB 361 so that within 30 days we can have the next one. So we're still working on it. Worst case scenario, I assume if we don't have an actual date, we may want to consider meeting right before May 5th, which is the last day that there's a possibility the governor delete this option, so that we have 30 more days after that to have a virtual meeting. So just we'll keep you posted. As soon as we find out more, we'll reach out to everyone with a survey for a meeting. Thank you.
And Trustee Keller, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. Council Leaderman, do you have any updated intelligence on whether we're likely to see the governor extend the special order on May 5th, or it's a complete black box?
Radio silence from Sacramento.
Very understood. Thank you. Agenda item 7, education and training. We have the Cortex report for your reviews. There's a Calipers special virtual trustee roundtable, a one-day affair, April 29th. And there's also the Sackers Spring Conference in Rancho Mirage coming up in May. Any trustee or public comment on any of those items?
I'm signed up for B.
For B, okay. And I'm sorry, trustee, Vice Chair Jennings, you had a comment there?
Where's Rancho Mirage?
It's Palm Springs area.
So the Sackers is now going to be in person.
I think Sackers always rotated between different locations. This is not the Berkeley educational session that we both attended. I think that's still going on.
Virtual.
I don't know if it's in person or virtual.
That'll be in July.
Oh, July.
Yeah, this is more like the General Assembly. For
Yeah,
California.
they meet twice a year, Vice Chair Jennings in November and May, and they alternate between Southern California and Northern California. So if they have the main meeting in Southern California in the Palm Springs area, then they'll have another one in November in the Northern California area, as opposed to Calipers, right? Which is only similar conference, little shorter, and it's only once a year in the month of March.
And also rotates between Southern and
Northern California. That is correct.
Normally, okay.
Roberto, is there maybe, we have 2 new trustees, anything on this that you really recommend for them? Because, as you're starting out, some of these are quite good and that might be helpful.
So good question. I finally have my onboarding, which I should have said that in my reporting, but I forgot, with Trustee Linder. I think it was excellent. I can't speak for him, but it was very good to be able to get to know him a little better, and at least for him to also not to only meet me a little better, but also to provide some background or information that is very, very important for trustees. And we are trying to schedule a similar onboarding meeting with new trustee Abasti. As soon as we can schedule that, I certainly will mention this, but when I met with Trustee Linder, I mentioned the Calipers and Sackers conferences and other kind of programs, and so I will do so when we meet with Trustee Abasti as well.
Okay.
And I'll say from my own point of view, the Sackers Summer Berkeley course, I think, is extremely worthwhile. So if people are interested in that, I would encourage them to take that.
Yes, I recommend that. If you start at the beginning and kind of work your way up, it goes through a lot of what Harvey's gone over, and it goes over, some of the investing, different philosophies on investing.
The focus this July is at that meeting in Berkeley will be on risk in the investment portfolio.
Okay. All right, if there are no further comments under agenda item 7, do we have any proposed agenda items?
I want to mention, Trustee Horowitz, we have spoken about this, you and I, in our own meetings. I just made a note to myself, maybe May or June, bring back some disability discussion and the thought of perhaps creating a disability committee of your own peers going forward. So I just wanted to mention that I need to work with staff for timing, but it probably be June, but we'll let you know if it be May or June.
And I believe we said we would bring that to the full board for discussion and action.
That is correct. And of course, it doesn't have to be done in one sitting. We can certainly have more than one discussion if that's what the board will entertain at that point, but that's the goal. That's correct.
Okay, so we don't know what month that will come, but it's coming.
Yes, in the near future.
All right.
And how about, I'm just curious, any update for future items on the pension obligation bond? I know they're going to Superior Court, or there's.
I haven't heard anything, Vice Chair Jennings. The city has been busy actually with the work of issuing another specific bond that they just issued recently. So I suspect that they're still going through that process and finalizing reporting to the city council. But I'll check with the finance director and see if there are any updates on that.
Okay.
I believe Counsel Liaison Davis reported last month that the judicial process on that was somewhat extended, and they probably would not have approval before the fall, whereas at one time we thought it would be in the spring or summer. So I think it's a bit delayed. And of course, that doesn't mean they're actually going to take action, but simply have the court approval. All right, if there are no other proposed agenda items, then this meeting is adjourned. Those who are remaining for committee meetings, please stay on the line.